In 1940, German bombers crossed the English Channel almost every night. They were Heinkel He 177s, massive four-engine beasts. They flew over London, Coventry, and Liverpool in waves, dropping thousands of tons of bombs. The raids were meant to break Britain's will. At first, they worked. Whole streets vanished under fire and rubble. The British called it the Blitz. Between September 1940 and May 1941, the Luftwaffe, Germany's World War II Air Force, dropped more than 30,000 tons of explosives on British cities. The Germans believed the night made them untouchable. Their crews trusted darkness more than armor. They flew without fear, convinced that the enemy had no way to find them once the sun went down. Reports from the German Air Ministry repeated the same message. British air defenses are blind at night. They think the Allies are blind and the night. They are wrong. Dead wrong. And their mistake is about to cost them everything. Their plane, their lives, their entire strategy. This is the story of a colossal intelligence failure, a story where arrogance met innovation. They thought American radar was a joke, a crude, primitive toy. They thought they could own the night. They thought they could bomb with impunity, until they couldn't. Welcome. Today, we're diving into one of the most dramatic and undertold chapters of the air war over Europe. It's a tale of secret labs, brilliant minds, and the terrifying moment a German bomber crew realizes the sky is not empty. It's the story of how the United States, often seen as a latecomer to the radar game, developed a system so effective it turned the night sky from a sanctuary into a killing field. And how German spies, for all their cunning, missed it completely. Let's go back to the beginning. To understand the German mistake, we have to understand their success. In the early years of the war, the Luftwaffe ruled the night. Their Knickebein system, and later the more sophisticated X-Gerät and Y-Gerät, were radio beam navigation aids. Think of them as invisible highways in the sky. German bombers would fly along these beams, guided right to their target with an accuracy that shocked the British. London burned. Coventry was devastated. The British people lived in fear of the night. The British, of course, were not idle. They had their own radar, a technology they pioneered. The chain home system was a network of giant towers along the coast that could spot incoming raids while they were still over France. It was a game changer during the Battle of Britain. But chain home had a major flaw. It was a ground-based system. It could tell you a raid was coming, but it couldn't guide a fighter to intercept it in the pitch black. Night fighters were essentially flying blind, hoping to get lucky with a visual sighting. It was like trying to catch a ghost with a flashlight. The solution was obvious, but incredibly difficult. Put the radar in the plane itself, an airborne intercept radar. The British poured their best scientific minds into this problem at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, or TRE. They made progress with systems like AI Mark IV, but these early sets were bulky, unreliable, and had a very short range. They were a start, but far from perfect. Now, across the Atlantic, in the United States, a different kind of war was being fought. Not with bombs and bullets, but with vacuum tubes and mathematics. American scientists at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the RAD Lab, were working on a new kind of radar wave. The British used long wavelengths, measured in meters. The Americans were betting everything on a much, much shorter wavelength, microwaves, measured in centimeters. This was a huge gamble. The technology to generate and detect these centimeter waves was brand new. It relied on a secret British invention called the cavity magnetron, a device that could produce massive amounts of microwave power. In 1940, A British scientific mission brought this precious device to America, hoping their industrial might could turn the theory into a weapon. And boy, did they. At the Rad Lab, a team led by men like Lee DeBrugge and I. Robbie worked around the clock. They weren't just building a radar, they were building a new sense for the pilot. Their goal was a system that was small enough to fit in a fighter plane, powerful enough to see a bomber at a useful distance, and simple enough for a pilot to use while flying a high-speed night chase. By 1942, they had it. They called it the SCR-720. To the British, who adopted it as the AI Mark X, it was a revelation. This was not the crude, sputtering radar of old. The SCR-720 operated on a 9.1 centimeter wavelength. It had a range of over 3 miles. It could show the target's range, its direction, and even its relative height on a small, green, circular screen right in front of the pilot. It was, for all intents and purposes, night vision. But here's the critical point. This was an American system, and in the minds of German intelligence, American technology was, well, suspect. They saw the U.S. as a nation of mass production, of quantity over quality. They respected British scientific ingenuity, but they dismissed the Americans as mere industrial copycats. Their spies in London and neutral capitals sent back reports on British radar advances, but the American contribution was often downplayed or ignored. The SCR-720 was seen as just another iteration of the same old, flawed British tech. This was their fatal blind spot. In the summer of 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces was preparing for a new phase of the bombing war. They had their famous daylight precision bombing doctrine, but they knew they needed to keep the pressure on Germany around the clock. So they began planning for a dedicated night bombing force. They would use their new heavy bombers, the B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, but they needed a way to find their targets in the dark. Their solution was a system called H-2X, an American-built ground mapping radar based on the same centimeter wave technology as the SCR-720. But the Germans didn't know about H-2X. Their radio intelligence, the vaunted B-Dienst, was focused on British systems. They were listening for the familiar signals of the British oboe and GHE navigation aids. The American H-2X operated on a completely different, higher frequency. To the German listing posts, it was just static, white noise. They had no idea a new, highly accurate American bombing radar was about to enter the war. So, in late 1943, the German night fighter force, the Nachtjagd, was feeling confident. They had their own sophisticated system, the Kammhuber line, a series of radar-controlled boxes stretching from Denmark to France. A ground radar would detect an incoming bomber stream and then hand off the target to a night fighter waiting in its box. The fighter would be guided by ground control until it was close enough for its own onboard radar, the Liechtenstein, to take over for the final kill. It was a deadly effective system against the British. The British bomber losses were horrific, but the Germans were about to face a new enemy in the night. An enemy they didn't respect, an enemy they didn't understand. On the night of November 3, 1943, the first major American night raid took place. The target was Wilhelmshaven, a major German naval base. A force of 183 B-24 Liberators from the 2nd Bombardment Division took off from their bases in England. They were not using British navigation. They were using the new, secret H-2X radar. They were flying a mission the Germans did not expect in a way the Germans could not counter. The German air defense was caught completely off guard. Their ground radar operators saw the massive bomber stream, but their usual tactics failed. The American bombers were flying at higher altitudes than the British. Their formation was tighter, and most importantly, the German night fighters, scrambling to intercept, found their own Liechtenstein radars were being jammed by a new, powerful American electronic warfare system called Carpet. The result was chaos for the Luftwaffe. The German fighters couldn't find the bombers, they couldn't get a radar lock, they were flying around in the dark, frustrated and confused. Of the 183 American bombers, only 2 were lost, a loss rate of just over 1%. For a first major night raid, it was a stunning success. But the real shock was yet to come. The Americans weren't just bombing at night, they were also providing their own night fighter escort, and these fighters were equipped with the SCR-720. This is where the story shifts from the bomber to the hunter, from the hunted to the hunter. The stage was set for a brutal, high-stakes game of cat and mouse in the blackness of the European sky, and the Germans were about to learn a very expensive lesson. They thought they could own the night, until the Americans turned on their lights.
Let's meet the hunter. His name is Captain John Jack Ladd. He's a pilot with the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron, USAAF. It's a cold, clear night in January 1944. He's sitting in the cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow, a massive twin-engine fighter painted a deep, non-reflective black. It's a flying radar station. In the nose is the SCR-720. In a separate compartment behind him sits his radar operator, or RO, Tech Sergeant Robert Bob Wilson. Jack's job is to fly the plane. Bob's job is to see in the dark. Bob is hunched over his scope, his eyes adjusted to the dim green glow. The screen is a circle of light in the blackness of the cabin. A small, bright dot in the center represents their own aircraft. Around the edge of the screen, a rotating line sweeps around like the hand of a clock. This is the radar beam, searching the sky ahead. Suddenly, a faint blip appears on the screen, about 2 miles out, slightly to the left. Bob's voice is calm, professional, cutting through the engine noise in Jack's headphones. Bogey, 2 o'clock, range 2 miles, slightly high. Jack doesn't need to see it. He trusts Bob completely. He banks the heavy fighter gently to the left. "Tally-ho," he says softly. This is the new reality of the night war. This is the power of the SCR-720. It's not just a detection tool, it's a precision weapon. The German Liechtenstein radar, by comparison, was a blunt instrument. It was a searchlight radar, good for finding a general area, but then the pilot had to use his eyes for the final approach. The SCR-720 was a gun sight radar. It gave the pilot a continuous, accurate picture of the target's position right up to the moment of firing. The German night fighter pilots were masters of their craft. Men like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the night ghost of St. Trond, were legends. They had honed their skills against the British, using a combination of ground control, their own radar, and incredible eyesight to find and destroy bombers. They were confident. They were arrogant. They believed their Liechtenstein gave them an unbeatable edge. They were about to be proven wrong in the most brutal way possible. On the night of March 30th, 1944, the Royal Air Force launched a massive raid on the Bavarian city of Nuremberg. It was a disaster for the British. Over 900 bombers took part. The weather was clear, the moon was bright, and the German defenses were perfectly prepared. It was a perfect storm for the Nachtjagd. In a single night, the RAF lost 96 aircraft. It was their single worst night of the entire war. The German night fighter force was euphoric. They believed they had finally mastered the art of the night defense. They had crushed the mighty RAF. Their confidence was at an all-time high. They felt invincible. Just 2 nights later, on April 1st, 1944, the Americans launched their own night raid. The target was a railway marshalling yard in the French city of Aulnoy. It was a relatively small force of 159 B-17s, but it was a test. a test of their new integrated night bombing and fighter system. The German response was immediate and aggressive. They scrambled their best night fighter wings. They were eager for another easy kill, another chance to add to their score. They flew up to meet the bomber stream, their Liechtenstein radars sweeping the sky. What they found was not the slow, predictable bombers they were used to. They found a wall of electronic noise. The American carpet jammers were broadcasting a powerful signal that completely blanketed the German Liechtenstein frequencies. On their radar screens, instead of a clear target, they saw a blizzard of static. Their primary weapon was blinded. At the same time, high above them, the American P-61 Black Widows were on the prowl. Their SCR-720 radars were operating on a frequency the Germans couldn't jam. Bob Wilson and his fellow ROs were seeing the German fighters as clear as day on their scopes. The hunters had become the hunted.
One of those German pilots was Oberleutnant Paul Zorner, a seasoned ace with over 50 victories. He was leading a flight of Junkers Ju-88 night fighters. He had his Liechtenstein switched on, but all he could see was snow. He was frustrated. He knew the bombers were there, but he couldn't find them. He decided to try a visual search, flying a wide orbit, his eyes straining against the darkness. He never saw the P-61 coming. From his debriefing after the war, he described a sudden, terrifying flash of light from below and behind. His plane was rocked by a violent explosion. His right engine was gone. He managed to bail out, but 2 of his crew were killed. He had been jumped by an enemy he couldn't see, using a technology he didn't know existed. That night over Illinois, the Americans lost only 2 bombers, but they claimed 11 German night fighters were shot down. The actual German losses were probably around 6 or 7, but the point was made. The balance of power had shifted. The night was no longer a German sanctuary. The German high command was stunned. Their intelligence services scrambled to find an explanation. How could this be? They interrogated their pilots. They analyzed the wreckage of their downed fighters. They listened desperately to the radio chatter. But they were looking in the wrong places. They were still focused on British technology. They couldn't conceive that the Americans, the amateurs, had fielded a radar system that was not just equal to their own, but superior. Their arrogance was their downfall. They had a fundamental belief that their engineering was the best in the world, that their scientists were the most brilliant, that the Americans were simply incapable of such a leap in technology. This wasn't just a tactical error, it was a cultural and intellectual failure. The losses began to mount, not in 1s and 2s, but by the dozens. In April 1944 alone, the German night fighter force lost over 200 aircraft, a staggering number. Their experienced crews, their irreplaceable aces, were being wiped out faster than they could be replaced. The Kammhuber line, their once impregnable defensive wall, was crumbling. The human cost was immense. Imagine being a young German crewman, a radio operator, or a gunner, sitting in the back of a Hinkel HE-219 or a Messerschmitt Bf-110. You're flying a mission you've flown a dozen times before. You feel safe in the dark. Then, without any warning, your plane is torn apart by cannon fire from an enemy you never saw. There's no dogfight, no heroic last stand, just a sudden, violent end in the silent void. This was the new terror of the night sky. On the other side, the American crews felt a growing sense of control. There were no longer just passive targets, they were active hunters. The P-61 crews developed a deadly routine. They would orbit just outside the main bomber stream, their radars searching for the telltale signatures of German fighters trying to sneak in for an attack. When they found one, They would stalk it, close in silently, and then unleash a devastating burst of fire from their 4 20-millimeter cannons in the belly and 4 .5 caliber machine guns in the turret. The psychological impact on the German pilots was profound. They were used to being the predator. Now they felt like prey. They started to report a new, mysterious enemy. They called it the Black Widow, or sometimes just the Ghost. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it was deadly. The USAAF was careful to keep the P-61's capabilities a secret. They didn't want the Germans to understand what was happening to them. They wanted to maintain the element of surprise, to keep the fear alive. And it worked. The German night fighter force was paralyzed by uncertainty and fear. Their morale, once sky high after the Nuremberg raid, plummeted. They thought they could control the night until the Americans turned their own tactics against them. By the spring of 1944, the war had reached a critical turning point. The Allies were preparing for the invasion of Normandy, the D-Day landings. The success of this massive operation depended on one thing above all else: air superiority, not just during the day, but at night. If the German Luftwaffe could launch a massive night attack on the invasion fleet or the beachheads, it could be a disaster. The Allied planners knew this, and they had a secret weapon. It wasn't a new bomb or a new tank. It was the hard-won control of the night sky over Western Europe, a control they had achieved largely thanks to that underestimated American radar. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, the Allied air forces launched a massive deception and suppression campaign, codenamed Operation Bodyguard. A key part of this was Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable, which used small boats and aircraft to create fake radar images of a massive invasion fleet heading for the Pas de Calais, the location the Germans expected. But the real, decisive action was happening in the skies over the actual invasion area. The job of the American night fighters was clear: protect the real invasion fleet at all costs. On the night of June 5, 1944, as thousands of ships crossed the Channel, the P-61 Black Widows were on high alert. The German response was weak and disorganized. Their night fighter force, already bled white by months of heavy losses, was a shadow of its former self. Their pilots were exhausted, their planes were in short supply, and their confidence was shattered. They sent up a few scattered patrols, but they were easily swatted aside by the vigilant American fighters. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the German Luftwaffe managed to fly only a handful of sorties over the beaches. The night before and the night after, the skies were effectively an Allied monopoly. This was a monumental achievement. It meant the invasion troops could land, consolidate their positions, and build up their forces without the constant fear of a devastating night air attack. It was a direct result of the radar war that had been won in the preceding months. Back in Germany, the situation was desperate. The leadership finally began to grasp the scale of their intelligence failure. They realized the Americans were not just using British hand-me-downs. They had their own highly advanced radar technology. But the realization came far too late. German scientists at the Telefunken Company and other labs scrambled to develop a counter. They created a new, more powerful airborne radar called the FUG-240 Berlin, which also used centimeter waves. It was a good system, arguably as good as the SCR-720, but it was a classic case of too little too late. The first FUG-240 sets didn't enter service until the very end of 1944. By then, the Allied bomber offensive was at its peak. The American and British bomber streams were so large and so well protected that even a good radar couldn't make a difference. The German night fighter force was operating from airfields that were being bombed daily. They had a critical shortage of fuel. Their pilots were being thrown into combat with minimal training. The human story here is one of tragic futility. Young German pilots, some barely out of flight school, were being sent up in their new advanced fighters to face an enemy they had no hope of defeating. They were brave, but they were doomed. The technological edge, the strategic initiative, and the sheer numbers were all on the Allied side. Let's look at the numbers to truly understand the scale of the collapse. In the first half of 1944, before the full impact of the American radar and jamming was felt, the German night fighter force was claiming over 300 Allied bombers a month. By the second half of 1944, their claims had dropped to less than 100 a month. Meanwhile, their own losses were catastrophic. From January to June 1944, they lost over 1,000 night fighters. That's an entire air force. The American night fighter squadrons, on the other hand, were racking up an impressive score. By the end of the war, the 422nd Night Fighter Squadron alone was credited with 43 enemy aircraft destroyed at night. Their secret weapon, the SCR-720, was a major factor in every single one of those kills. The irony is thick here. The Germans, who had pioneered so much of the early electronic warfare and who had been the masters of the night for so long, were undone by their own hubris. They looked at the United States and saw a nation of factories, not a nation of inventors. They saw a junior partner to the British, not a peer competitor in the field of science and technology. They failed to understand the unique power of the American system, the combination of brilliant academic science from places like MIT, the massive industrial capacity of companies like Western Electric and General Electric, and a military that was willing to take big risks on unproven technology. The Rad Lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts became a factory for radar ideas, churning out new systems at a pace the Germans could not match. The German system was more centralized and more rigid. Their scientific efforts were often hampered by bureaucratic infighting and the ideological interference of the Nazi regime. They were brilliant engineers, but they were working in a system that was fundamentally broken. This story isn't just about radar. It's about the nature of innovation in wartime. It's about how a single, well-placed technological surprise can shift the balance of an entire campaign. The American radar didn't win the war by itself, of course, but it was a crucial, decisive factor in winning the battle for the night sky, which was a crucial, decisive factor in winning the war in Europe. The German spies had all the pieces of the puzzle. They had reports of American industrial output, they had snippets of technical intelligence, but they lacked the imagination to put it all together. They couldn't conceive of an America that was not just building more planes, but building smarter ones. They were blinded by their own prejudice. They thought they could outthink the Americans, until the Americans outbuilt and out-innovated them. So what was the final toll? By the end of the war in Europe, in May 1945, the German night fighter force had been all but annihilated. From a peak strength of several hundred aircraft and thousands of highly trained crewmen, it was reduced to a handful of scattered, demoralized units with no fuel and no hope. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies, day and night. The American investment in radar had paid off in spades. The SCR-720 and its ground-mapping cousin, H-2X, were used in every major bombing campaign of the last 2 years of the war. They allowed the Allies to bomb with a level of accuracy and consistency that would have been impossible otherwise. They saved countless Allied aircrew lives by providing a shield against the night fighters, and they played a direct, vital role in the success of D-Day, the operation that opened the final front against Nazi Germany. But the legacy of this story goes far beyond the end of World War II. The secret radar war of the night skies was the birth of modern electronic warfare. The cat-and-mouse game of radar detection, jamming and counter-jamming that began over Europe in 1943 is the same game that is played today by stealth fighters and advanced air defense systems. The P-61 Black Widow, with its dedicated radar operator, was the prototype for all modern airborne warning and control systems. The idea of a single aircraft being a self-contained sensor and weapons platform is now standard doctrine. The entire concept of seeing first, shooting first in air combat was born in those tense, green-lit cockpits over France and Germany. For the German side, the story is a permanent case study in military intelligence failure. It's taught in war colleges around the world as a classic example of mirror imaging, the dangerous assumption that your enemy thinks and acts just like you do. The Germans assumed the Americans were technologically inferior because they believed themselves to be superior. It was a fatal case of arrogance. There's a human lesson here, too. It's a reminder that in any conflict, the side that is most adaptable, most open to new ideas, and most willing to learn from its allies will usually have the advantage. The Americans were not too proud to accept the British cavity magnetron. They were not too rigid to build an entirely new type of radar from the ground up. They were not too slow to put it into combat and use it to devastating effect. The German crews who were lost by the dozens in those final years of the war were not cowards. They were victims of a system that failed them. Their leaders failed to see the threat. Their intelligence services failed to provide a clear picture. Their entire strategic outlook was based on a false premise. They were fighting a war in their heads that no longer existed in the real world. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, you can see a P-61 Black Widow on display. It's a massive, imposing aircraft. If you look closely, you can see the radome in the nose, the smooth, rounded cover for the SCR-720 antenna. It's a silent monument to a secret war that was won not with brute force, but with a flash of green light on a radar screen in the middle of the night. The story of the German spies who doubted American radar is more than just a historical curiosity. It's a powerful narrative about the dangers of complacency and the unpredictable nature of technological change. It's a story of surprise, of a moment when the underdog revealed its true strength and changed the course of history. They thought they could outthink the Americans, until the Americans outbuilt and out-innovated them. If you found this story of secret radar and nighttime battles as gripping as we do, please give this video a like. It really helps us out. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden stories of World War II. There are so many more tales of courage, innovation, and shocking surprises waiting to be told. Thanks for watching. Until next time.